I can't thank you enough. By the way, as you may have seen the response, even as you were leaving the auditorium, I'm not sure I've ever seen a reaction on any of the venues at Chautauqua like last night.
Oh, people were extraordinary. I mean, it just means so much to somebody who's speaking to know that the audience is receptive, because the point of it was to make common cause with the concerns that everybody has, not just as lawyers or judges, but as citizens of North America. We're worried about the same things, we're proud of the same things, and I just felt so happy that they responded the way they did. I can't get over it. I don't remember either having a reaction like that from a group of strangers. It was wonderful.
One of the best responses I received is one of the heads of the Everett Jewish Life Center, which is a significant population base on the grounds and a facility. Her name is Arlene Hoffman, and she's from Canada. And she goes, I've never been as proud to be a Canadian than I was yesterday.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, please extend it
Well,
back.
this is all, since this is being recorded for posterity, this is all because of you and John Barrett, and the fact that the Peterson-Barrett Dream Team made the Abellas visit possible is something we'll never forget. So you've been extraordinary. Thank you.
Let's make sure it's not the last.
Promise?
You promise. We'll get you here. Born in 1946, at what point did your dad or mom sit you down and say, excuse me, Judge, but Justice Rosie, this is what happened? A little bit about what happened in your family.
That's a very good question. It was seamless. There was never a moment. It was something I knew because their friends in Toronto when we came to Canada were also people who'd been survivors, and of course I remember Germany. And I knew the stories. I was aware that they had come from some other place and some other experience. And because they were so open to talking about it all the time, I mean, the way I cry every time I think about it or talk about it, I never saw them cry. They were very upbeat, they were very positive. I used to ask my mother the most mundane questions, like how did you wash your hair in concentration camp? What was it like when you, this is not mundane, how did you feel when you found out your son had been killed? And my father talked openly about how difficult it was for him to do the physical labor, and he was saved by a doctor. He stopped eating when my mother came back with the news that their son was killed. So the story is quite remarkable. The story is that they owned a factory. My mother's family owned a factory in a city called Ostrowiec in Poland. And the Germans took over the factory when they came in. They had somebody called a Treuhändler. And my parents knew German, and they worked well with him. He let them carry on their business. And he warned them that there was going to be a roundup. So they gave they didn't know where they were going to go, and he didn't know where they were going to go. But they gave their 2.5-year-old son to a woman who had worked in the factory for 40 years with some money, and said, we don't know where we're going, but take care of him until we come back. And then they ended up at a work camp. My mother bribed one of the guards at the work camp to let her out to go back because she thought it was a safe place for her son. She went to the woman's house. The woman had disappeared. Her sister was there. This is only 2 days after they were taken to the camp. And the sister said she panicked when she saw the Nazis coming into town and gave the baby to my father's parents, who lived in a little town not far away. They had a little bookshop. They were not wealthy people. So my mother went, saw my father's father cleaning the streets. There had been a roundup that morning, and it turned out that the baby was taken with my father's mother and the youngest of my father's 3 brothers to Treblinka. And the father had stayed behind to clean because their 2 older brothers had run away when they heard there was a roundup, and I always wondered what happened to them, but they were never found. So she went back to the camp, told my father, what happened, and he stopped eating. Ended up in the infirmary, and a doctor there, I don't know if he was German or must have been a German doctor, liked him because he was educated, and got him an office job, which got him through the first part. So these are stories. I knew when I got older what the experiences were for other people my age whose parents had been Holocaust survivors. And they lived with demons, and it was very hard for them, and sad homes. And I have no idea why my home was so sunny and optimistic. I mean, there were 3 adults who survived, my mother, my father, and my grandmother. And it was, of all the houses that I visited when I was growing up, it was the most positive, upbeat, open, encouraging. They weren't smothering me. They encouraged me to take risks. They weren't hovering the way I do with my kids. So that's just luck. You can't pick your parents. So I knew all these stories. There was never a sit-down moment. There were different times when different stories came out.
Is it hard for you today to talk about what you just said?
No. Unless I'm talking to a group of people. And it's funny, one-on-one it's easier. If I'm talking to a crowd and when I speak, I write my own speeches, obviously. My heart comes out when I talk to a crowd in a very different way. Now it feels professional because I'm speaking to a colleague in a setting which honors one of the greatest judges ever. But when I give speeches, it's incredible to me how I can't ever get through that story. And I tell it every chance I get, because I want people to know that what they have in front of them may be a Supreme Court judge, but this is a judge who remembers where she came from and what she came from. And I find that hard, and I really can't understand it. And my husband sits in the audience every time going, "Oh God, you cried again." And it's involuntary. Don't want to do it. Now, I remember, you raise a very interesting thing. When did I even start talking about that? Not before 1983. In 1983, I did a royal commission, which you don't have here in the United States. It's kind of a roving inquiry into policy questions. And it was a one-person royal commission into whether there should be affirmative action in Canada, because women's groups were screaming for it. The government just didn't want to have to do it because business didn't want it. So the way you deal with problems often in Canada is, let's set up a royal commission, it'll delay it for a while. So they gave me a year to study what the barriers to employment were for women, Indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and visible minorities, non-whites. And that was a year where I traveled across the country, met with each of those 4 groups in 17 cities in 6 weeks, and with business groups and with labor groups. And listening to their stories about what it felt like for them brought me back to my own story, which it was just who I was, but it didn't feel relevant to share with the public. And the first speech I gave while I was writing that Royal Commission was the 100th anniversary of the British Columbia Law Society. And I found myself writing a speech about what I thought equality means, and what it means to me, and how lucky I was to be a Canadian. The whole acknowledging differences. And I learned what I felt by studying the American jurisprudence and being very uncomfortable with it. The 14th Amendment jurisprudence, everybody's the same, just doesn't work for people who are in a wheelchair and want to be treated differently. Otherwise, they don't get into the building because there's no ramp. Anyway, so I started in 1984 when I was 38, and I've been speaking about it ever since.
We met at the Jagiellonian University. Is that that's the same location your dad went to school?
That's where he went to law school.
Giving a speech there which had everybody riveted, was that an emotional moment?
That was very hard. Yeah. That was hard. Just coming on the campus, coming to Jagiellonian University was really hard. We'd been there a few years before, because when my husband was the president of the Canadian Jewish Congress in '93, he led a delegation of Canadians for the 50th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So we went to Krakow, and I went to the law school. I asked where the archives were, and the archivist said, when was he here? And I said, I don't know, sometime in the 30s. So she pulled down, it wasn't bombed, so they pulled down some huge folios from the different years. We had one from 32, from 34. Anyway, we found out that he was there, he started in 1930, and he was there in 34. And she showed me his page, and on every page was his religion in 3 places. And every course he took, and all of his marks, and where he lived. And as we left, and she made copies of all of that for me, and as we left, she said, I guess I'm wrong about how professional this is. She said, chapeau, it was very hard to be a Jew in those days in this law school. So that was the first time I went to the Jagiellonian. The second time was when I met you and John, and to be there as a speaker at a conference. And being able to speak about those issues and what it meant to me was closing the circle.
Was your dad, Jacob, right?
Yeah.
Who was educated to be a lawyer and, of course, came into Canada, could not get a license. Was that a frustrating factor for him?
Never saw it.
Yeah.
He never, ever, they never complained. They were just so grateful to be in Canada, and it was all about my sister and me from now on. He became an insurance agent. We lived in Kensington Market, which is downtown Toronto, and he went on the block, about a block away, in downtown Toronto, there was an insurance agency, and he walked in and he said, I'd like to be an insurance agent. Didn't know what else to do. So he became an insurance agent for the next 20 years until he died. And he was fine. I mean, we did okay. We never thought about money, never thought we had financial issues. We didn't. We were middle class, but I never, ever heard him complain. But what I knew was I saw him reading all the time, discussing all the time. He remained an intellectual, but he was also an extraordinary insurance agent. He would come home every day at 6, actually 4:30 to be there when we came home, have dinner, and then go back out. At the time, I had no idea how that had extended his day, right? But he wanted to be with us. Mostly because we played piano. It was 2 hours a day. It was a big part of our lives, playing classical piano. And he sat with me and played the piano with us. When I became a lawyer, there were no women I knew who had children who were lawyers. No mothers who were lawyers. No role models. So I found myself doing what he had done without thinking about it. I just came home from the office, and I was a litigator. Came home every day at 6, saw our kid, eventually 2, but 1, and then came down to the office after I put them to bed with Itchy. So 8 o'clock, and then 9 o'clock. Eventually it was 10 o'clock when they went to bed, and I said, I'm not staying here anymore. You guys are on your own. And would go down to the office at the latest at 10 o'clock, just to make sure, for my benefit, not for theirs. They had their father there. They didn't need both of us. I needed to see them. So I just followed that tradition, kind of intuitively.
You took on, as a lawyer, a variety of rights cases, family law matters, stuff which you advocate on behalf of women, children, etc. Did your dad, as you were growing up, your dad, mom, were they affiliated, associated with certain organizations which had the advancement of others as part of their
Nothing.
purpose?
Absolutely nothing. They never belonged to anything. My father started a synagogue. He wasn't a religious man, but he was a very learned man. But they belonged to absolutely nothing. And I can tell you that their biggest influence was they made sure I read books. So I had finished Dostoevsky by the time I was 13, in the original English. And I read all of the 19th century French novelists, Hugo. And that's where I learned about human rights. Because in really good literature, it's universal. And I learned what life was like for real people. I always thought my life was very privileged. I had 2 parents, I had a grandmother, they all loved me, I did well in school, I did well at piano, I was in the newspapers with my sister because we kept winning prizes at the Kiwanis Festival. My life was charmed. And books showed me what life was like for other people. My clients showed me, when I started practicing law, what life was like for other people. And I started practicing law in '72 when the women's movement was starting in full gear. Indigenous people were starting to talk about self-determination. Discrimination on the grounds of race was coming to Canada because we had waves of immigrants from Jamaica. You'd be living with it all of your life. And I did whatever walked into the door. And because I was the only woman lawyer around, I was known, and that brought other people, and the ones who could afford to pay subsidized the ones who couldn't afford to pay. But it wasn't that I went into the law for the purpose of being a human rights person. I didn't. I did real estate and corporate work and criminal law and everything that walked into the office, I did. And as I got older, I came to understand what my passions were.
Jewish and being female, did any of that early 70s, did you see any discrimination? Was that part of the, again, we're here in America,
Yeah.
we're talking about Canada, I'm not sure I know.
There were so few women lawyers. I mean, I never saw another woman in a courtroom that I didn't feel discrimination. The judges tested me, and I practiced with one other lawyer and then went on my own for a couple of years. So I wasn't in a large firm where it was a pay your dues. Well, I wasn't in a large firm because a large firm wouldn't hire me. So I didn't feel it as a woman, and in fact I felt advantaged as a woman because all of these issues were floating around, and I was very high profile in speaking about those issues. Being Jewish, I don't know. I don't really know. I spent the rest of my life thinking, is this anti-Semitism or sexism, or is it just that they don't like me? My views are very, I'm not a moderated person. When I think something is wrong, I speak out. So that attracts, I think, a certain attention. But I wouldn't say it was anti-Semitism the way people in the 40s and 50s, even 60s experienced it. And sexism became a real issue when there were a lot of women who started to come into the profession. And suddenly it wasn't, she's adorable, she's got 2 kids, she's practicing law, isn't that cute? It became, oh my God, these are people who are competing with us. And that's when I started to see an unwillingness to accommodate the difference being a female lawyer could be. For me, it was easy because I had a husband who was a professor. He came home every day. My kids used to think they had 2 mothers. One had a beard and the other one didn't. So I didn't experience, I did it the way I wanted to do it and could do it. I would come down to the office when most of the lawyers in my office were leaving. I would see them leaving as I would come back at night. But I didn't feel it, but I know it was there. And once I figured out that it was there for other people, mostly through my clients, that's when I started speaking out. And then being a family court judge is where the rubber hits the road. That's where the law was at its most sexist, because women couldn't own property, couldn't earn separate money, were expected to stay home, even if they had careers. And then they lost the ability to go back into the workforce. So that all became like a Polaroid, much more clear in the 70s.
You're on the highest court there is today, but did you find by practicing in family court that's probably the hardest thing you did?
The hardest thing and where I learned to be a judge. I knew from my clients that my life was not like their life, and that I was very lucky to have the life I had. But in family court, I really learned to listen, because it wasn't how I felt about raising kids. It wasn't how I felt about what the right environment was, because I could put it in play if I wanted to. I had the money to do it. I had a full-time nanny to do it. These were people who went from what Walter Lippmann called the day's drudgery to the evening's despair. And I was judging them from a position of privilege, and it made me very respectful and cautious. The juvenile delinquency, I think I sent 2 kids to reform school in 7 years. That's it. Foster care, only reluctantly. But you never know when you're dealing with children what the future will turn out to be and whether what you did was right. But I found it very difficult and very, very challenging, because if I made a mistake, I was ruining somebody's life. So it was where I learned to be a judge. It was the crucible.
As one of the first women, did you feel like you were ahead of the wave of the kind of female infusion of lawyers, so that somebody had to be at the kind of the head of it all? You were being the first Jewish woman judge, country's youngest ever, all that first pregnant. Did you feel like you were fortunate to be ahead of that wave?
I just felt I was lucky to be me, but I didn't feel I was part of a wave because I had no idea there was going to be a wave.
Yeah.
It turned out to be a wave, and I always felt that people who are in a position of strength should help those who are coming through. So I started making speeches to alert people to the fact that they had to look out for what was coming and be sensitive. But it wasn't to be a leader. I didn't run for the bar. I didn't join any organizations either. I guess like my parents, because it was work and family for me.
You spent much of your career dealing with labor issues and stuff. Did you find, in family issues, did you find that Ruth Bader Ginsburg became part of your understanding and views? Because she seems to have somewhat taken a path not too dissimilar from yours.
I met her later in life, but I didn't know her in the 70s. We didn't know about, we knew about Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan career. I mean, we knew all of the Ms. Magazine literature. We didn't know about the cases, except that the cases we saw in the United States on women really weren't very good. So I didn't know about Ruth. I knew about the ACLU, but I didn't know what they were doing for women. It's interesting. I think both the Americans and the Canadians had a lot to learn about women's rights, and I value her role in making sure that she argued those cases that came to the court's attention. But the person who really launched the ship for women was Johnson. When he did voting rights, when he did Title VII, Title IX, all of that discrimination, it came from law. I mean, we remember there was a time when all of the progressive momentum was coming from legislation, and not from the judges. And it wasn't until the Warren Court that you started to get that same taking turns at the head of the justice parade in the courts and the legislatures. But I didn't know her, but I've been an admirer of hers and many of the American Supreme Court judges. Jackson preeminently, Brennan. I like a lot of what Blackmun did. It won't surprise you to learn I like Breyer. I like Sotomayor, Kagan, Ruth, Kennedy. I did a Q&A with Clarence Thomas. I liked him too in Savannah. So I like the judges, but we don't get much from their jurisprudential approach. We find ourselves working a lot more closely with the Europeans, the South Africans, even the Israelis on terrorism, because they're strong rights protectors in the face of daily terror. But less the Americans, and notwithstanding the enormous talent that the American Supreme Court has, it just has a different approach to what the role of the judge is. And I think they're under more serious constraints. I
never say it's a controversy, but always a discussion on the Supreme Court is whether you can look to, or it has evidentiary weight of jurisprudence outside of the United States. So this is something that may occur in Europe, Canada, elsewhere. Do you have such a pause regarding looking outside of your borders?
We don't have most of your pillow fights on the courts. I mean, the originalism debate, which nobody takes seriously in Canada, or the rest of the world, frankly. It's I see it, and most of us see it, as a jurisprudential way to keep judges from expanding rights at a time when we think it's the court's role to ever vigilantly keep up with rights protection. So that's for originalism. As for international law, that also is new, and it came around the same time as originalism, and I suspect from the same sources. I mean, the Federalist Society has had enormous impact on some of the jurists. Early jurisprudence, I'm sure you know, constantly looked at what was going on around the world. The Brandeis Brief had international and comparative law. So it's a part of what judges do. There's a judicial conversation going on globally with judges and courts all around the world. We follow each other, we cite each other, we benefit from each other. On the theory that there are very few new legal issues, and we're interested in how other countries deal with technology, family law, rights. I mean, is there really anything new? Although each country has its own approach to it. But our international law, comparative law approach is in the very first section of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It says, these rights, which we got in 1982, are guaranteed, except insofar as any limit is justified in a free and democratic society. So right off in the constitutional protection of rights is an admonition, a direction to see what other free and democratic societies are doing and whether the government's limitation of a right is justified comparatively. So, I mean, international law, comparative law, what's wrong with looking to see what other people do? You don't have to follow it. I mean, I do read American jurisprudence. Sometimes you get the best ideas from reading something you don't agree with. Isaiah Berlin said there's no pearl without some irritation in the oyster. So I just don't see the point of being insular and looking downward and inward instead of seeing the world you're a part of and then applying it to your own universe, by all means.
We at the Jackson Center annually host an event when we bring in all the chief prosecutors here, and it's a couple of them are all Canadians. Robert Petit and Louise Arbour are all part of that. By the way, was Judge Arbour part of your world?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I've known her since the 70s. She was a colleague on the Court of Appeal. She left in 2004 with one other colleague, and I stepped into one of the two vacancies that they created. So I've known her for 40, 50 years.
Out of curiosity, what's she doing these days, you know?
She's in a law firm in Montreal. She, I think, has a mandate on migrants at the UN. I think she'll always do good work, I think.
You mentioned some of your favorite justices, and I'd be remiss if I didn't focus in and zero in on Robert Jackson and what Robert Jackson means to Justice Abella.
He's a hero in so many ways, I can't even tell you. His judgments, he spoke in his own language, and it's so refreshing to read a judgment that doesn't cite a turgid proposition and then have 10 footnotes after it, or 10 citations to justify the obvious. I do it too. So he writes as if he's writing a novel. He just tells the story of the case and tells the story of the law. And the narrative sweeps you along and says, this is why you don't intern Japanese Americans. This is why you have no protection for hate speech. Think about what the impact is. So he spoke over the law directly to the public, it seemed to me. And there was a passion in his rigor, and that's a gift, to be intellectually passionate is not something that you see very often, anywhere, let alone in a judge. And I don't know that you've had it since, actually. So he was restrained in the sense that he didn't go off on flights that made no sense to me, but he didn't hold back. If he saw something that just offended him, it came out in beautiful language. So he's a hero because of how he thought about justice. He's a hero because of how courageous he was in sticking to his ground. He's a hero because of what he did at Nuremberg. In so many ways, I think he's the role model for judges, let alone Supreme Court judges.
You've received 20 honorary degrees, and you were the first sitting judge elected to be a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, an organization consisting of Canada's leading scholars. When folks come up to you and say, one, can I have your autograph, or two, you're my role model, how do you react to that?
I give them my autograph and I say thank you. I mean, it's wonderful. I think if you're somebody like me who's had both, the bad press, the good press, how could she decide this? What was she thinking? Protecting the right to strike, protecting whatever. Then you know that it's not anything you can presume just because you're working hard and doing your best. So when people say thank you, I appreciate that. I'm grateful. And I also know those very people may be really upset at something I do the next time I read a judgment. That's okay. But I'm always happy when people say, your work is useful. It's a brick in the building in the Canadian justice system. So do I say doesn't mean anything? It means something.
Okay. When a judgment's delivered, I don't know how that process is in Canada, but there's always reaction. Immediately.
That's why I'm not on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to whether you follow, read, or
no.
react to that.
And my clerks who do read it, I know when I don't hear from a clerk for a couple of days that the Twitter reaction has not been good. When they were sending me a tweet within 15 minutes, then I know it's good. They kind of self-censor. I have no way of knowing. So the reaction's immediate, and of course there are editorials in newspapers. Those are sometimes good, sometimes not good. But I have independence, I have tenure. I'm there till I'm 75, and I'm there to make judgments, not that are popular. I'm there to make the judgments I think are the right judgments to make in the circumstances. In The Age of Innocence, I love Edith Wharton. She writes about a lost time that I don't even get, really. But Mrs. Manson Mingott was the oracle in New York. If you wanted to know what you were supposed to think about whom and about issues, you had Mrs. Manson Mingott. Well, judges don't have that. I don't even know what public opinion means. So we do our best to try to anticipate. We're not unaware that certain judgments are going to go down differently than others. Gay marriage, assisted dying, a lot of people who feel very strongly the other way from our much more leave it to the individual to decide approach. But you do what you think is right, and you do let history judge you. I've seen so many of the things that I said that were controversial in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, they're mainstream now. So I try to anticipate, but I'm not bound by it.
Canadian Supreme Court has a limitation, age-related. We do not have that here. Do you see the pros and cons of it as you're getting closer to that age?
I think it's great. I could even make a case that 70 would be better than 75. I'm 72. I have 3 years to go. At I don't know what I would feel like if I were somebody who had to decide year after year whether it's time for me to go, time for me to stay. I like the idea of knowing that I'm there. My mandate extends to a certain period. Everything that I do has to be done within that period. If it were indefinite, I actually don't know how that would feel. You'd have to ask your colleagues. No other jurisdiction in the world has it, this open-ended, stay as long as you want.
Yeah.
And I think they're right. I must say, my preference would be that you should know when your time is done so that you can replenish and get fresh blood in. I've had 9 new colleagues in 14 years, 15 years. And each one that comes in, you go, is this going to work? Because you're 9 people sitting around a table. You make every single decision with each other. You didn't pick them. They didn't pick you. I mean, just think about what it would be like to be making every important decision every day with the same 8 people. I mean, I tell people it's like having 8 husbands. And if you know what it's like to decide where to go to dinner or what movie to go to, imagine the biggest issues of the day with 8 strangers. And you got to get along. So that's hard. So I think it's important to step back at a certain time and let new people come in and take over.
Yesterday, you had the presentation followed by Q&A, which then gives the public direct access to a justice of the Supreme Court. Was there a question or two that you were worried they might ask that they did not ask?
No. No, because if they asked a question I couldn't answer, I would say so. One of the gentlemen who came to the microphone didn't ask a question. He made a statement that I thought it was a very good statement and didn't require icing from me, so I let it go. But no, there's nothing. If I say I'm prepared to do a Q&A, I'm prepared to do a Q&A, and I don't put restrictions on what they're going to ask me. And if I can't answer it, I'll say so. So
what question does your husband ask you that sometimes you don't answer?
Why are you always on your BlackBerry? Is that fair? I think that's about most of it. I have no answer.
His career, he's incredibly noted and acclaimed writer of history, and especially Jewish history. Do you help him? Do you help him along? I mean, you got your 2 career paths here.
It's asymmetrical. I'll tell you how it's asymmetrical. I like him to look at lectures that I'm giving, and I talk to him about my work because I need his input, and he's a fabulous writer. He does everything in one draft. My clerks don't even see what I write for 3 or 4 drafts, and it's rare that I put out a judgment that I haven't done in about 20 drafts. Mm-hmm. So I always want his eye just to tell me whether the lecture makes sense. Does this word work? I'll call him from the office and say I'm looking for a word for, and discuss it with him. He'll discuss what he's doing with me, but I don't read his work, and when I see it, it's like a beautiful piece of sculpture. It's just so good. So I need his input. I feel comfortable getting that added benefit. He doesn't. But he's had an extraordinary impact on Canadians because he told a story nobody knew. He started the field of labor history in Canada. There was no Canadian labor history until he wrote his PhD thesis and taught it. Then he moved over into social history and immigration history. And then he wrote this book, None is Too Many, about Canada's keeping out the Jews from Nazi Germany from 33 to 48. We couldn't get in. I have papers of my parents trying to get into Canada after the war from Stuttgart, and they couldn't get in until 1950. So he told that story, and it shocked Canadians who saw themselves as benign, different from other countries, and they had no idea that there was an anti-Semitic foreign policy. So he was out, very public, very well known, president of the Canadian Jewish Congress on top of teaching. And his book, None is Too Many, is on everybody's list of the 100 most important books in Canada. So I felt sorry for our sons in a way because they had him high profile, they had this mother who was high profile, not always in a very good way, But he became one of the leading public intellectuals in Canada. He stopped when I became a judge because he was afraid that he would write things that would bring controversy to the court. And to be honest, it makes me so sad because we've lost a really important voice. And he used to write op-eds, he still gives lots of lectures and speeches, but he's been very cautious. Without discussing it with me, he just decided that he wasn't going to do that. When I was on the Court of Appeal, there were 24 judges. If I took a hit, it wasn't a big issue. He just felt it was more respectful of the court, even though I think it's a huge loss and nobody on the court wants him to stop. Anyway, we'll see. 3 more years, he'll be back at it, I hope.
You received an award for human rights by the Canadian Bar Association and the International Commission of Jurists, whose president cited you as one whose entire life has revolved around the cause of human rights. She has shaped Canadian policy in equality rights and has also had a profound impact on human rights law and policy outside Canada. Her contribution to society as a lawyer, teacher, commissioner, and judge have always been shaped by her profound humanity.
That's really nice. That is very nice.
And it's really you, and I'm thrilled. I can't tell you how thrilled we are to have you here.
Me too. Me too. Who would have guessed that Jackson and I would come together in this way? Because I'm a product of what he fought for. I mean, he kind of prepared the way for my entry. So it's very sentimental to be able to be here and to be so warmly welcomed and received, and to continue on the tradition that Robert Jackson started.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific.